between people who can just get up, like Matthew, and give his talk without reading anything, and those of us with different kind of brains that obviously need to read our paper. So I do apologize, I will be reading a paper, but hopefully it won't be too boring. So as you'll see, I have again changed my title. So I submitted an abstract, I called it Situating Injured Minds. Then I wrote a different paper, called it Sensing Injured Minds, and now I have returned back to Situating Injured Minds. So today's world is marked by a particular preoccupation with the brain and what the neurosciences might tell us about humanity, health, and behaviors. Medical sciences, particularly the neurosciences and psychiatry, remain the dominant point of reference for understanding the brain generally and brain injuries more specifically, which is my area of research. In neurology, conventional scientific findings from neuroimaging postmortem brains and animal studies, like rat and mice brains, for instance, are prioritized. Contextual, political, subjective, and experiential knowledge are usually discounted or deemed non-evidence. Yet brain injuries are most obviously felt and embodied by those who sustain them. So my research explores new possibilities of understanding brain injuries by concentrating on the embodied and situated experiences of patients who live with altered neural states, or what are often referred to in the brain sciences and psychiatry as brain injuries, disorders, or illnesses. In this way, my paper diverges from many of the papers you hear today, since my work starts from the lived experiences of individuals with a range of neurological conditions. My research also considers how these new understandings that focus on situated and embodied experiences might engage with and augment neuropsychiatric knowledge about brain injuries and mental health, with a strong attention to evidentiary claims, in other words, what counts as evidence. My research team and I explore these issues primarily through sensory ethnographic studies and arts-based methods, which we believe and hope to prove facilitate collaborative and empowering frameworks for understanding brain studies or brain injuries, moving away from pathologizing and damage-centered research. So this conference and the previous two-day workshop are entitled The Situated Brain, Culture, Context, and Ecologies of the Mind. In science and technology studies, or STS, the term situated immediately brings forth feminist STS scholar Donna Haraway's classic paper and her approach to understanding knowledge-making practices in science. So when I say that my research focuses on the situated and embodied experiences of people living with altered neural states, I mean this in the Haraway sense. But this is deeply disciplinary. It is a dominant motif in social sciences and some humanities, but not in the biosciences. So I want to use this opportunity before I begin with the rest of my paper to talk to you about what a situated brain might look like from the point of view of an STS scholar who is also trained as a cultural anthropologist. But since we are an interdisciplinary crowd, I think it's important to begin by trying to create a shared vocabulary with you. What does Donna Haraway mean when she speaks of situatedness? She says, I am arguing for a politics and epistemologies of location, positioning, and situated, where partiality and not universality is the condition of being heard to make rational knowledge claims. So, for Donna Haraway, it is a matter of knowing, of problematizing objectivity, and to a lesser extent, subjectivity in the sciences. It is about who gets to make knowledge claims, on what basis, and what counts as evidence. She tries to position herself between a social constructionist perspective, which, to oversimplify, you might argue there's no fact or truth that is not shaped, created, or embedded in values, beliefs, and cultures, and a scientific or positivist account, which argues facts and science exist outside of culture, and that pure objectivity does exist. Haraway suggests a partiality, an approach that might make room for lived embodied experiences, for the messiness, but also maintain a partial objectivity. She continues, these are claims on people's lives, the view from the body, always a complex, contradictory, structuring, and structured body, versus the view from above, from nowhere, from simplicity. So she is arguing that we need to take seriously the lived, embodied knowledge that comes from below, not only the abstract scientific knowledge that comes from often disembodied laboratories or disembodied at times, computational models, or the armchair anthropologist. She is not arguing solely for the lived experience, but for a recognition that a scientific knowledge without an engagement with the lived, often messy, often contradictory experience as a form of evidence will result in a science that is simply inadequate. So I build on the work of feminist scholars like Haraway and Karen Berard to think about how scientific knowledge is inseparable from modes of being. In this way, I approach the study of brain trauma as a type of situated neuroscience, where the embodied experiences of brain trauma matter to practices of knowing. My ethnographic approach, which explores both lived accounts and clinical practices, is a way to get at the entanglements of the embodied matter of injured brains and the discursive practices of neurology and neurosciences more broadly. Following Haraway, I recognize brain trauma as political, ethical, ontological, and epistemological. A feminist STS approach allows for complex understandings of the brain, accounting for multiple knowing subjects, and providing space for novel understandings that help to level action across fields of expertise. This method also encourages an investigation of the forces and actors that shape and reconfigure the production of scientific knowledge and clinical practice in the brain sciences. So in my research and my current project called A Situated Neurology, we think about situatedness in two different ways. So the first way is to think about the ways in which culture, history, geopolitics, and socioeconomics influence and shape the field of neurosciences. So for instance, how might neurology and brain health be differently shaped in different regions of the world? Anthropologists and historians have written about Kuru and Creutzfeldt-Jacobs disease as examples of this. Kuru, though caused by prions, and you would think would be the same everywhere in the world, actually takes a very different shape in Papua New Guinea because the way it's shaped by cultural values and social practices. So matters of fact are not produced in isolation from meaning and values, as Berard argues. In this way, situatedness as a concept also offers possibility for making visible the historical and cultural specificity of the neuroscientific arguments being made. There is a lacuna in research that considers how neurological and neurosurgical encounters in non-Western settings may produce very different outcomes, in spite of a shared global field of neurology. Our attention to local articulations and differences in neuromedicine builds on the work most noticeably of anthropologist Margaret Locke, whose comparative ethnographic scholarship considered cross-cultural variations in medical practice and epistemology for brain death and dementia. So such an approach to neurology, for instance, might consider the historical trajectory of neurology and how those bodies of knowledge have shaped contemporary theories of the brain. So for instance, in Africa, neurology's past is insidiously connected to racist colonialist understandings of the African body and African mind. Practices of trepanation, theories of phrenology, and British colonial surgeons in the early and mid-20th century shaped the contemporary field of neurology and neurosurgery in South and East Africa. In the 21st century, neurology in sub-Saharan Africa is shaped by other forces, global forces including global forces like structural adjustment programs, other global pandemics like HIV that drain parts of the health system, and overseas medical training opportunities. For instance, the first Kenyan neurologist was trained in Canada and started working at Kenyatta National Hospital in just 1972. Some parts of Africa suffer from a lack of both qualified personnel and well-equipped neuroscientific or neurosurgical facilities. Insufficient state funding and research facilities aggravate the situation and discourage well-trained neuroscientists from practicing in their homeland, especially in less economically stable regions like East Africa. Okay, so the second way situatedness informs my work on altered neurostates is by prioritizing the lived, embodied experiences of individuals living with brain injuries or other altered neurostates, and by trying to elicit experiences that often escape conventional scientific methods. STS scholars have argued that one of the gaps in neuroscientific research in animal postmortem and neuroimagery is that the brain is treated as if it exists in isolation, disconnected from that which lies outside the lab. Medical models of the brain often miss what we feel, what cannot be seen or measured in brain imaging technologies, and they dismiss many affective and personal experiences that are often intangible for patients recovering from brain injuries. things like apathy, exhaustion, dream disturbances, auditory hallucinations, and felt differences. A situated brain demands understanding the brain as particular, localized, and situated within a shifting world. So I'm going to share a story of one of our interlocutors today, a research participant who we've been working with for a few years now, and whose experience influenced me to ask the questions we are now asking about what a situated brain and situated neurological practice might look like. The perspectives of individuals who shared their stories with my research team problematize the disciplinary divisions between psychiatry and neurology, brain and mind and body. Such dichotomies are not reflective of the lived experiences of patients who experience, for example, sonic hallucinations, distorted hearing, loudness sensitivity, alongside emotional trauma and physiological changes of the brain. And thus, as a team, we are moving away from talking about mind, body, and culture as separate, and instead we draw on Margaret Price's work to talk of body-mind as one word. Price explains that according to this approach, because mental and physical processes not only affect each other, but also give rise to each other, that is because they tend to act as one, even though they are conventionally understood as two, it makes more sense to refer to them together in a single term. Though Price doesn't attribute body-mind to Donna Haraway, it does resemble Haraway's similar approach to nature-culture, which she coined as a way to describe the ways in which nature and culture are deeply entwined, inseparable, actively remaking each other and the worlds around them. The other reason I prefer body-mind over body and mind is influenced by the work of another feminist SDS scholar, Karen Barad. Barad writes of interaction rather than interaction between phenomena. Informed by her physics training, she explains that at a subatomic level, particles are entangled. Electrons move instantaneously. Things are in flux. The boundaries between observer and observed, apparatus and phenomena produced, emerge, and are defined as a result of interactions within larger phenomena. Interaction understands agency as not an inherent property of an individual or human to be exercised, but as the dynamism of forces. Both material phenomena, brains, and discursive practices, like neurology and psychiatry, though they are much more than discursive practices, include how we create meaning, are involved in these interactions. Interaction does not presume separate entities prior to the action. So in this way, we can never talk about the brain separate from the mind, separate from the body, or even separate from nature culture. The brain, mind, and the world around us are always shaping and reshaping each other. So I want to talk about these two forms of situatedness, the localized, particular, and the lived embodied, by sharing an account today with you of a research participant that I call Patient M. The patient's accounts have historically played a central role in the anthropological study of biomedicine. Patients' experiences have largely been eclipsed by those working in the social study of neuroscience or my own field of STS, and even medical anthropologists who have instead favored the laboratory and clinic as sites of research. The absence of first-person accounts from the point of view of people with disabilities themselves contributed to the emergence of both the critical disability and neurodiversity movement. As Arthur Kleinman has argued, the doctor-patient relationship is a fundamentally moral relationship. It is a reflection of our contemporary attitudes about sense of perception, cognition, as well as a vehicle for upholding those values. The researcher-patient relationship is no different. Neurological research that's engaged with the experiential first-person account of life after injury can assist in turning patients from objects that are known by medicine to subjects who know, again by accounting for the lived experience, but also the ways in which body-minds are co-constitutive with neuropsychiatric knowledge. Whether explored by medical anthropologists, artists, or neurological researchers, accounts of lived experience deepen our understanding of brain injuries. Okay, so patient M. In 2009, 39-year-old white female patient was working in East Africa when she experienced a severe traumatic brain injury in Western Kenya when she was attacked repeatedly with a rungu. It's a large, long weapon, something like a baseball bat, though it has a large grapefruit-sized ball at the end and a little point, made of hardwood used by nomadic pastoralists in the region like Maasai, Samburu. The attack occurred at her home late in the evening. She survived the brutal attack, which had occurred along Lake Victoria, about 20 minutes from the nearest town. Patient M was taken to Aga Khan Hospital, small local private hospital in Kisumu, Kenya, where she was met by the Kenyan hospital staff and American doctors working for the US Army's Walter Reed Project. They have large field stations in this region of Kenya. In 2009, she'd been working in Kisumu for about 2 years, and she knew a lot of the expat community. It's a relatively small town where everyone knows everyone, and her friend had called the CDC director, also has a lot of field stations, as they rushed her to the hospital, which explains all the American doctors and CDC administrators waiting at the hospital when they arrived. This is the Aga Khan private hospital. Taken into the trauma room, the medical staff aimed to stabilize her and to determine the nature of her injuries. She was bleeding profusely, so she was covered in blood, and the trauma room staff were trying to find the source of the blood. Given the nature of her injuries, she had sustained bruises and lacerations over much of her body, including some serious contusions at the nape of her neck. There was concern that she had broken her neck or that her vertebrae were fractured. Patient M was fortunate enough not to lose consciousness during the attack or in the early hospital visits, and she recalled the various clinicians demanding that her neck get stabilized with a brace as they carefully washed away the blood, all the while talking to her, asking her what had happened. It turned out the hospital didn't have any cervical collars or spinal boards, and so someone was sent to fetch 2 bags of ugali, basically maize flour used for making ugali, a local staple similar to basically wheat used for, or flour used to make cornbread. Those were placed on each side of her head and secured with tape to stabilize and immobilize her head and upper spine. Within an hour or two of arriving at the hospital, she started vomiting, leading to concerns that her injuries were worse than appeared, and she was prepared for a CT scan. The scan detected a crushed skull, including compressed skull bone and a range of bleeds. She was scheduled for an emergency craniotomy to release the pressure building up in her skull, resulting from multiple subdural and epidural contusions. There was no neurologist or neurosurgeon available in the region, and so an orthopedic surgeon performed a rudimentary surgery with an American surgeon standing in to observe. In the middle of the surgery, the cranial drill being used to alleviate the pressure drops to the floor, and because they only had 1 drill in the hospital, they wait 15 minutes for it to be re-sterilized and then continue the surgery. Clinicians attending the surgery later commented on the very awkward small talk that was meant to pass the time as they waited in the operating theater. With no neurologist to be found, the next day colleagues who worked with the CDC called in a California neurologist who was in the country studying HIV-related dementia. HIV/AIDS was endemic to the region. She was asked to come and assess patient M. She recommended that patient M be medically evacuated as soon as possible because she witnessed cognitive decline and believed her condition was deteriorating. After consultation with the Canadian Embassy in Nairobi, patient M was medevaced the following day to Mill Park Hospital in Johannesburg, South Africa, where she received another craniotomy and a cranioplasty to rebuild her parts of her skull which had been shattered. At Mill Park, she was attended by a range of medical specialists, including a trauma surgeon and a neurosurgeon, one with world-class medical infrastructure in support of neurology-related cases. This is also another private hospital, but very different than the one at Aga Khan. Patient M was placed in a neuro-ICU ward where she spent the following month recovering from the surgeries. The South African nurses were aware of how patient M had become injured, a physical attack late at night in her home, and these nurses matched whatever trauma they thought she had endured with their own unsolicited stories. One nurse showed patient M the scar in her neck that ran from ear to ear, a result of being attacked and someone attempting to slice her neck open. Another displayed the scars on her abdomen and back from stab wounds, another scars from being shot. In Johannesburg, daily violence was normalized. There was nothing unusual about another violent attack and the embodied after effects. These Black nurses simply shrugged at her injury, not registering it as a form of trauma, just daily life in the post-colony. After a month in Mill Park Hospital, and once her staples were removed and a final CT conducted, she was cleared to return to Canada, where she saw another neurosurgeon, then a neurologist, and then was referred to a brain injury rehabilitation center, where an intake worker administered the Montreal cognitive assessment, concluding that she did not have a TBI since she had scored 29 out of 30. Though the intake worker admitted she could clearly see the scars of 44 staples and a shaved head, which seem to clearly indicate head trauma and surgery. So patient M's story, I think, offers an opportunity to explore the situatedness of neurology and altered neurostates in relation to historical and biopolitical contexts as the patient moves in and out of different clinical contexts, nation states with different histories, cultures, and neuroscientific histories too. Patient M recovered with minimal long-term effects. Back in Canada, she had MRIs and CTs and endless other tests as part of clinical trials at UBC. She had regular follow-ups with her neurologist to monitor any remaining issues. She is employed full-time, relatively healthy, though she does report some long-term and short-term memory issues exacerbated by stress, exhaustion, including confabulation, anomia, and jamais vu. But my interest in patient M isn't really about her recovery, but the way it speaks to the two different forms of situatedness, the way her experience of the injury doesn't necessarily align with clinicians, neurologists with tests, but also psychologists who want to insist on a trauma narrative. And as a case that moves through different socio-cultural spaces, allowing us to catch a glimpse of how neurological care is shaped by larger social processes like scientific imperialism, colonialism, racism, and unequal capitalist flows. Though patient M's story speaks to resource scarcity of medical equipment and the forces of structural effects, I do want to move beyond thinking about resource restrictions to think about how contemporary neurological practices and discourses might be shaped by historical approaches, scientific ideas, and local sociopolitics. I want to focus here, before I wrap up, on one particular point of patient M's case, that is her experience with the MoCA test. I approached this clinical assessment tool as an element of an infrastructure within neurology and psychiatry, rather than as a separate object, discourse, or measure of inquiry. So in this case, again, I understand it as agential, interacting with and shaped by local environments and actors. I think patient M's story, particularly the MoCA test, demonstrates just how and why the actual materiality of an apparatus might be constitutive of the phenomenon, including shaping local biologies. So MoCA. Testing is one means by which biological or technical facts are established. Thinking with Haraway and Berard, the traditions of knowledge, skills, and practices that form part of testing are located within particular laboratories and engineering disciplines, and they are learned and practiced in situ. But such tests like MoCA, a tool for clinical assessment, miss a lot of experiences and phenomena. The MoCA test was developed here in Quebec, and Suze is going to talk a lot more about MoCA in a bit. It's been translated into over 100 languages and dialects. Except for one version, there's been no attempt at adapting them to kind of local cultures or making them more culturally appropriate. The change to make it more culturally responsive is the First Nations test, where words and images have been replaced. So rhino, camel, lion are replaced with an image of a salmon, an eagle, and a wolf. Blanket, jump, feather, water, and cedar replace keywords for testing memory, which are normally face, velvet, church, daisy, and red. It was not used for patient M in either Kenya or South Africa, or at least she doesn't remember it. But its use in Canada as an intake assessment to the Brain Injury Rehabilitation Center fails to measure or make sense of her altered neurostate, both immediately after the event or the injury and many, many years later. From a STS point of view, we've been neglectful in studies of testing, again, in favors of clinical trials and experiments. So most of the writing on testing is on HIV testing or prenatal testing, with some more recent research on COVID testing. In HIV testing, there's been a dominant area of interest, in part because of the prevention approaches focused on testing. Get tested for HIV. If you're positive, then you'll be more careful, and that will work as a form of prevention. But there was also concern about testing biases, misdiagnoses, and stigma. But significantly, the MoCA test for patient M, carried out just weeks after she had been discharged from 1 month in a neuro ICU ward with 2 neurosurgeries, missed her brain injury entirely. Yet the clinician conducting the test relied on the test results rather than on patient M's clearly visible body-mind evidence and patient M's self-reporting. The test structures understanding of what counts as a brain injury, dismissing patient M's lived experience, and also structuring what it means to be someone who might live with an injured mind. In follow-up visits with her neurologist, she was assessed again with the MoCA test. List as many words as you can that begin with the letter F. Fish, friends, food, forever, furry, friends, she continued, funny, and then she started to struggle. Fluke, she said. She was thinking about the intestinal worm. And then fluke again, as in coincidence. And then fuck. At the end of the test, her neurologist went over the test with her. She had done well, 29 out of 30. It's a pass. But fuck was circled on the bottom of the score. When she asked her neurologist why, the clinician stated that the cursing was a sign of disinhibition associated with brain injuries. Patient M laughed, explaining that she had always cursed and that fuck was just part of her daily vocabulary. Here I want to return to broad. Interaction acknowledges the impossibility of a classically understood objectivity in which an apparatus like a MoCA assessment as a technology used to measure brain injuries or cognitive decline, or a person using an apparatus, the clinician or the neurologist doing the test, are not considered to be part of the process that allows for specifically located outcomes and measures. Patient M is either considered not brain injured the first time she takes the test, or brain injured the last time she takes the MoCA, which was 10 years after the injury, even though she scores high because she says fuck. This is just one example of why we need to think about the situatedness of body minds and neuropsychiatric care, and why we need to consider local and individual histories in brain sciences, and why understanding the interaction between tools, actors, and ecology will work for a deeper and more accurate understanding of neuro and psychiatric conditions. Thank you.